The night of March 23rd, 1969, settled over war-zone sea like a wet, suffocating blanket. Out in Tay Ninh province, just a few miles from the Cambodian border, Firebase Nolan sat on a low rise of laterite clay, its perimeter traced in sandbags, rusting concertina wire, and half-buried claymores glistening faintly with dew. Under a sky with no moon and only a haze of muted stars, Specialist Fourth-Class Daniel Reese stood alone on the North Berm. The sour smell of sweat, red dust and cordite ground into his jungle fatigues, and tried not to think about how many people on the other side of that darkness wanted him dead. He was 22 years old and looked older. A lean, long-armed farm kid out of Oklahoma who had traded the wind across wheat fields for the stagnant heat of Vietnam. In the flare-dimmed world of Firebase Nolan, he carried the title that mattered most when the tracers started flying. M60 Gunner, Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 27th Infantry Regiment, 25th Infantry Division, Tropic Lightning. The others joked that the gun was his girlfriend. He treated it more like a child he could never afford to drop. Around him, the fire support base murmured and clicked like an idling machine. The generator's uneven thrum vibrated through the hard-packed clay. A radio down by the TOC leaked a tinny song from Armed Forces radio until someone barked to turn it down. One of the 105 crews laughed too loudly at a joke no one would remember 5 minutes later. The smell of burned powder from the afternoon's registration fires still hung low over the guns, mixing with diesel fumes and the sweet, sour reek of the trash pit. Beyond the triple strands of wire, the jungle was a black wall. No lights, no movement, just the sense of weight, trees, vines, elephant grass, and somewhere among them, eyes. On the map in the TOC, the enemy was dots and arrows. A VC local force company, maybe reinforced by main force cadre, slipping across from Cambodia. In Reese's head, they were narrower things, rifle barrels resting on roots, fingers on triggers, men who were perfectly willing to crawl on their bellies for hours just to get close enough to throw one grenade into his gun pit. Nolan existed to watch for them. It was a node in a larger grid. 4 105s, 2 155s, radios talking to other fire bases, ARVN outposts, and distant command posts that felt like another planet. On paper, the big guns gave the Americans the advantage. In practice, the base was also bait. If the enemy wanted to hurt the artillery that was tearing up their trails, they had to close the distance. That meant crawling into the killing ground that men like Reese were paid to sweep with steel. His sector was the north, the shallow depression and tree line that intelligence kept circling in red wax pencil. The land dipped gently away from his berm, then rose into scrub and thin trees. In daylight, you could see the faint traces of old bomb craters and half-filled spider holes. At night, it was just a darker shade of dark. Reese had walked it in the afternoon, counting paces, measuring arcs of fire with his eyes. Now, in the washed-out half-light of distant flares, he did the same thing in his head. He checked his watch. 23:47. The numbers glowed faintly green. Another 13 minutes until midnight, another 5 hours until dawn would turn the base into an oven. He shifted his weight, feeling the familiar bite of the M60's sling across his neck and shoulder. The gun sat on its tripod, muzzle depressed slightly, a belt of 7.62 NATO draped over the sandbags in front of him like a metal snake. 3 ammo cans nested at his feet. A spare barrel leaned within arm's reach, wrapped in a rag. Behind him, PFC Morales, his assistant gunner, nodded in and out of wakefulness, chin on his chest. "You hear that?" Reese murmured. Morales blinked, listening. For a few seconds, all they heard was the layered noise of the night, insects in electric chorus, the distant bark of a dog from a village that wasn't supposed to exist on the map, the whisper of rain that hadn't quite started. Reese was about to shrug it off when something faint slipped through the mix, a metallic tap, like steel kissing steel where it shouldn't. "Trip flare," Morales whispered. "Could be," Reese said. Could be somebody dragging wire where it doesn't belong. He eased the big starlight scope toward his shoulder. The first-generation night vision sight was clumsy, heavy, and moody, powered by batteries that never lasted as long as promised, and showing a world in smeared green. Still, it was better than guessing. He swept the scope across the depression and tree line, the image swimming with static and ghostly shapes. Grass, scrub, trunks, nothing that screamed man. Down by the dog run, one of the mine dogs barked once, sharp and offended, before its handler hissed and yanked at the leash. The dog fell quiet, but Reese noted the direction. Dogs smelled things he couldn't. The radio on his hip crackled softly with perimeter traffic. Sectors checked in. A mortar crew reported ready rounds on hand. The radar operator near the TOC mumbled about possible movement at the edge of his screen, then hedged. Could be birds, could be rain, could be nothing. A flare ship had been requested out of Tai Ninh, but hadn't yet grumbled into the sky. For now, illumination would come from the base's own mortars and the odd handheld flare. Lieutenant Collins made his inspection circuit like a man pacing the edge of a cliff. Young, thin, with a map case that always seemed too big for his frame, he paused at each fighting position long enough to ask the same three questions. "You okay? You need anything? Anything weird out there?" By the time he climbed into Reese's pit, his helmet was beaded with sweat despite the cooling night. "How's it look, Reese?" he asked, eyes already on the dark ahead. "Too quiet, sir," Reese said. "Always is before it goes stupid." Collins tried a ghost of a smile. "You and that pig are the anchor up here. If they come through this sector, you cut them down, and you yell for everything that can shoot. Copy?" "Yes, sir." Collins squeezed his shoulder, the gesture half legit, half superstitious, and moved on. Reese watched the lieutenant's back vanish between sandbags and thought, not for the first time, that rank made you stand up in places where common sense told you to stay low. They say wars pivot on neat dates in history books. For the men who live them, the turning points are smaller, a sound, a smell, a shift in the air. For Firebase Nolan, the pivot began just after midnight, when the first warm drops of rain tapped gently onto Reese's helmet. Within minutes, it thickened into a steady drizzle, slicking sandbags and turning the clay berm into something between glue and grease. In that drizzle, 40 Viet Cong in black pajamas and mud-darkened fatigues eased their way through ditches and folds of ground toward Nolan's northern and northwestern wire. Sappers carried Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes of explosives meant to punch lanes through wire and mines. RPG gunners hunched behind them, careful to keep warheads low. Riflemen crawled in the sappers' wake, grenades taped to harness straps for quick hands. They had rehearsed this on sand tables and in clearings miles away, tracing the shapes of Nolan's perimeter with sticks. The base's guns had hurt them for months. Tonight, they meant to push back. On the berm, Reese pulled his poncho liner tighter around his shoulders and checked his M60's feed tray one more time. The act was half habit, half prayer. He could smell the rain now, earthy, metallic, and beneath it the faint burnt sweetness of propellant that never really left the air around the guns. His skin tingled. The jungle noise had not stopped, but something under it had changed. He couldn't have defined it. He didn't need to. Men who survived long in the bush all talked about it the same way later. A feeling that the world around you had begun to lean. He didn't know that in the months and years ahead, people would talk about what he was about to do in phrases that sounded like bad movie taglines. 1 man against 40, suicidal charge, human beehive. He didn't know his name would end up in after-action reports and commendations, and late-night veteran stories told over too many beers. All he knew was that the darkness in front of him had shifted from dangerous to expectant, like a held breath. And somewhere out there, hands were tightening on weapons, and boots were sliding silently, inch by inch, toward the place where his sector and their plan were about to collide. The first thing to announce the attack was not a mortar, not a rocket, but the sudden incandescent crack of a trip flare kicking off in the northwest sector. It went from absolute darkness to a violent wash of white light and sparks, hissing as it burned down on its parachute and bathed the wire and kill zone in a harsh, unnatural day. "Trip flare northwest! Trip flare northwest!" Someone yelled over the company net, voice high and too fast. Reese flinched, even though the flare wasn't in his direct front. Light that bright in a world that dark always felt like a slap. He leaned around the corner of his berm, squinting toward the left. In the flare's harsh glare, he saw shapes that hadn't been there a heartbeat earlier. Flat silhouettes, pinned in the open between the outer strands of concertina and the tree line. Some hugged the earth, frozen. Others, caught mid-crawl, tried to surge forward, gambling they could reach the wire before the Americans fully woke. Sound followed a second later, piling on in layers. A sharp whistle from the tree line, a prearranged signal. The rattling chatter of AK-47s stabbing back at the base. An RPG's distinct whoosh, then a thunderclap against a mortar pit's berm, showering dirt and glowing fragments. A 105 howitzer fired beehive almost level, the shell bursting just beyond the wire and sending a sleet of flechettes scything through grass and bodies. Men yelled, some in English, some in Vietnamese, the words themselves secondary to the panic in their tones. "Contact northwest! Sappers in the wire!" The northwest sector gunner shouted, his M60 already laying down a solid, angry roar. Reese's own arc, dead north, stayed momentarily quiet. He could feel the attack hitting the perimeter like a hammer just left of him, but his field of fire remained a shadowy bowl. That was sometimes how it worked. The universe exploded 50 meters away, while your sector sat in a tense hush, as if waiting its turn. "Alpha 6, this is 2-1. Colin's voice cut through the chaos, forced calm riding on top of adrenaline. "Company-sized element probing northwest. Multiple RPGs on gun pits. Request immediate ILM and defensive concentration fire. Danger close. Over." "Roger, 2-1, came the talk, stepping on two other transmissions. "Stand by for ILM in your sector. Fire mission Delta 1 and Delta 2 inbound. All elements maintain sector." Reese swept his starlight over his front again. The green image jittered under his hands, still nothing but scrub and wet earth. His finger hovered near the M60's trigger guard, his mind fighting two urges: the instinct to start spraying toward the noise, and the drilled-in discipline to hold fire until he had real targets. The decision was made for him by a pop overhead and a harsh white glare washing across his berm. One of the base's own illumination rounds had detonated almost directly above his position. The flare drifted down on its parachute, swinging slightly, turning the depression and tree line in his front into a jerky, monochrome theater. In that jerky theater, all the things that had been invisible a second before snapped into clarity. They were already at the wire. Shapes lay pressed into shallow folds in the ground, no more than 10 meters beyond the outer concertina. He could see the shimmer of wet cloth on their backs, the dark tubular length of a Bangalore torpedo being inched forward by two men, the humped shape of another fighter with an RPG on his shoulder, keeping his head low. Further back, maybe 15, 20 meters out, a loose skirmish line moved in short, practiced dashes, using the front rank as cover. "Movement front!" Reese snapped into his handset. "North sector, multiple personnel within 10 meters of outer wire, sappers and RPGs. Squad plus, maybe more." "Hold until they commit on the wire," Collins answered. "Don't waste ammo on anything hugging dirt. Let the claymores and beehive do the first talking." "Roger," Reese said, though his jaw clenched. Watching enemy sappers treat your wire like an obstacle on a training lane rubbed every nerve wrong. Morales shifted behind him, peeking over the berm. "Jesus, Danny," he breathed. "They're right there." The geometry of Reese's gun pit, so tedious in daylight, suddenly mattered. His M60 was sighted to rake the depression in enfilade, cutting anything that moved across its width. But the shallow notch where the sappers now crawled was slightly off his main cone, favoring the adjacent rifle squad's position. That squad was under strength, down a fire team from last week's bunker complex fight. Their berm was lower, their fields of fire narrower. If the sappers blew a lane directly in front of that notch, the follow-on assault team would have a funnel. If that funnel wasn't covered by something heavier than M16s, the first few men through might die. But the rest would be in among the pits and gun crews before anyone could shift. Reese's eyes flicked to the left, toward the shape of the old forward bunker, an ugly, half-abandoned fighting position maybe 20 meters out, between his current pit and the wire. Built early in Nolan's life, when someone had drawn a larger perimeter on the map, it had later been judged too exposed and mostly left to the snakes. Its overhead cover sagged. Its sandbags were old and crusted, but its angle on that low notch in the wire was perfect. From that bunker, an M60 could pour fire straight into the breach point and sweep both flanks. From that bunker, whoever manned it would be the first thing the enemy saw when they looked up from their blown lane. "I can't cover the breach from here," Reese said, more to himself than the radio. "Not the way I need to." "What?" Morales asked, even though he already knew where Reese's mind was going. "That forward bunker," Reese said. "If they blow the wire right there, that's where the gun needs to be." Morales stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. "That bunker is a damn coffin. You step off this berm with that pig, every Charlie out there is going to light you up." LT said, "Hold your sector." Another flare popped, washing the world again in savage light. In that strobe, Reese could see the sappers wriggling closer. One of them was already trying to feed the nose of a Bangalore under the bottom strand of concertina. In his periphery, another RPG slammed into the far 105 pit. He felt the concussion as much as heard it. He thought about staying. He pictured the sappers blowing the path, the assault element sprinting through, the rifle squad to his right getting hammered, his own pit suddenly taking fire from behind and the side. In that picture, he and Morales still died, just a few seconds later, and with more friends around them. The choice stopped feeling like a choice. He grabbed a fresh belt, snapped it into the feed tray, and slung 2 more over his shoulders until they crossed his chest in an X. He stuffed 2 extra grenades into his pockets and clipped his radio handset higher on his harness. "Where are you going?" Morales demanded, voice cracking. "Forward bunker," Reese said. "That's insane. That's straight-up suicide." The squad leader in the next pit heard the last word and turned, face streaked with sweat and mud, eyes wide in the flare. "You take that gun out of this position and you leave us dry, specialist. I'll have your ass," he shouted. "You hear me? Sit down." Reese looked at the man, at the faces knotted behind him, then back at the wire. His voice stayed flat. "You won't have anything if they come through that notch and nobody's there to meet them." "This whole damn base is gonna meet them," the sergeant snapped. "Not at 10 meters, Reese said. "Not like this." Another RPG flashed, this one smashing into the berm closer to them, showering the tops of the sandbags with dirt and burning fragments. Someone 2 positions over screamed for a medic. The radio net dissolved into overlapping calls again, until Collins and the TOC hammered it back into order. Reese felt something in him harden. He didn't frame it as heroism or sacrifice, or anything big enough for a citation. It was an ugly, simple arithmetic. He could die in his pit and watch the wire fall, or he could die closer to the wire and maybe stop it. "Cover me when the next flare burns out," he told Morales. "You're out of your mind," Morales whispered, but his hands were already finding the spare M16 and a box of tracers. A flare overhead burned down to a nub, the shadows around them thickening as its light died. For an instant, the world went black, that absolute suffocating black that only jungle nights and power failures know. In that slice of darkness, Daniel Reese vaulted his own sandbag wall. M60 hugged tight to his chest and sprinted toward a half-ruined bunker that both sides silently agreed no sane man should try to reach. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the sound of his own boots hitting the wet clay, the slap of gear against his chest, and the ragged, shallow pull of his breath. Time did that strange thing it sometimes does under fire, stretching and compressing all at once. The distance to the old bunker was maybe 20 meters, broken by the shallow communication trench and a low lip of dirt. In the darkness between flares, it felt like a mile. He dropped into the trench halfway there, knees punching into mud, used its shallow walls for 3 long steps, then scrambled back up, lungs already burning. The M60's weight tried to twist him sideways. The hanging belts clawed at his thighs. Behind him, Morales and the nearest rifleman opened up with short, violent bursts, their tracers stitching the tree line and the folds where they guessed enemy eyes would be. The next illumination round went off just as Reese dove the last meter into the forward bunker. The world snapped from black to blinding white. AKs chattered in angry surprise, rounds cracking over the low parapet. Dirt and bits of rotting sandbags spat into the bunker's interior. An RPG warhead that had been aimed further back at his original position jerked off in reflex and exploded short, its blast shredding brush instead of men. He hit the floor hard enough that his teeth clicked. For a second, he just lay there, checking in that strange internal way whether everything still moved. Then training took over. He shoved the M60 up onto the bunker's front lip, planted the tripod feet in whatever solid surface he could find, and yanked one of the belts up into the feed tray. The view from the forward bunker was both better and worse than he'd imagined. Better, because the low depression in front of the wire was laid out almost perfectly across his sights. Worse, because he was so close now that he could see faces. The nearest sapper team was no more than 15 meters away, still hugging the shallow dead ground in front of the wire. One man had his hands on the Bangalore, the other had just started to rise into a crouch, perhaps to shove it the last crucial distance under the lowest strand. Their faces were thin, mud-smeared, eyes wide in the flare. Reese didn't fire a warning. He didn't have any to spare. He raked the depression with a short, heavy burst. The M60 slammed against his shoulder and roared, muzzle blast punching hot pressure into the bunker. Tracers walked through the nearest pair of sappers, cutting them down in a jerking spray of limbs and gear. The Bangalore torpedo bounced, then lay still. Reese shifted slightly and swept the belt further along the low ground, catching another pair of Viet Cong as they tried to flatten themselves further into the earth, as if willing the bullets to pass overhead. The effect on the attack was immediate and violent. The careful, stealthy crawl that had brought the enemy so close shattered into a flurry of desperate motion. Men bolted for the tree line or surged toward the wire, shouting. A Chicom grenade arced up and clattered against the forward bunker's half-rotten roof before rolling back into the mud outside and detonating in a fan of dirt and shrapnel that slapped harmlessly against the packed clay walls. AK fire concentrated on Reese's new position like a spotlight. Rounds pounded the sandbags in front of him, shredding the old burlap and spitting sand into his eyes. One bullet snapped through the right side of the bunker's rotten overhead, showering him with splinters. Another slammed into the M60's bipod, sending a painful shock through his hands. He tasted metal and dirt and the copper of his own bitten tongue. He kept shooting. Behind him, the nearest American position saw what he'd done and adjusted. Morales shifted the rest of the original gun pit's ammo, feeding Reese's exposed bunker with belts and shouted updates. The rifle squad that had been responsible for the notch poured M16 and M79 fire into the flanks, catching any enemy who tried to work around the edges of Reese's cone. Inside the bunker, Reese fell into a brutal rhythm. Fire, adjust, fire. Short, vicious bursts, just long enough to keep the gun from cooking itself, just short enough to keep rounds on target. The M60's receiver clanged and clattered, hot gas blasting back through the ejection port. Empty links rattled down around his knees like brass rain. The barrel began to glow, heat shimmering in the air above it. The Viet Cong tried to answer with RPGs, but the bunker's low profile and awkward angle bought him precious seconds. Twice he saw launchers rise at the edge of his vision. caught in the flare's unforgiving light, and twice he shifted and hammered them before they could line up. On the third attempt, the gunner got the round off, stumbling backward as he fired. The rocket streaked high, past the bunker, and slammed into the interior of the perimeter, exploding near a resupply pallet and scattering crates of sea rations. "Reese, status?" Colin's voice crackled over the net, almost lost in the thunder. "Engaging sappers front," Reese grunted between bursts. "They're trying to blow the wire. Multiple KIA in the notch, still more in the tree line." "You're taking everything they've got," Collins said. "Stay low. We're shifting beehive to your front. Confirm you're good for danger close." Reese glanced at the distance. The nearest enemy bodies were within 30 meters. The outer wire was closer. Beehive there would be like firing a giant shotgun over his head. "Send it," he said. "I'll hug the dirt." He yanked the M60 down, letting the barrel sit almost level with the bunker's lip, and flattened himself behind the sandbags. A second later, the nearest 105 roared again, its tube depressed until it looked wrong, and a beehive round screamed out into the darkness. It detonated just beyond the wire, showering the area in a storm of steel darts. The effect in front of Reese was horrific and absolute. Grass lay shredded flat. Bodies that had been crawling became torn, limp shapes. Shouts and cries cut off mid-breath. The carefully placed Bangalore torpedo vanished in a haze of dust and flying metal. When the dust settled enough to see again, the neat assault plan that had brought the VC so close was in ruins. The forward rank, the sappers and immediate security element, had been ripped apart. Behind them, the assault squad wavered. Some dropped prone, pinned by the belief that more beehive was coming. Others tried to surge forward anyway, screaming, either out of courage or because they knew retreat into that same kill zone was just another way to die. Reese was waiting for them. He popped back up behind the gun, shouldered it tighter, and with barrel now smoking in the drizzle, resumed his work. He would later remember the rest of the fight as snapshots rather than a smooth reel. The way the M60's barrel finally glowed cherry red, forcing him to yank it free with a gloved hand and slam the spare into place, while Morales, face pale and set, kept a fresh belt ready at the bunker entrance. The sudden, searing punch in his left shoulder, when a fragment from God knows what tore a groove through muscle and cloth, hot and wet down his arm. The surreal flicker of a flare ship finally arriving overhead, dropping fat cylinders of burning light that turned the field in front of Nolan into a stark, shifting checkerboard of shadow and bone-white brilliance. The enemy kept coming, but not in the clean waves they'd planned. Instead, they came in clumps and rushes, pushed by leaders shouting themselves hoarse in Vietnamese, dragged by momentum that had carried them to within sight of the guns they'd been told to destroy. Twice, small groups reached the wire and tried to haul it down by hand, throwing blankets over the razor and hacking with axes and wire cutters. Twice, Reese and every rifle within range poured so much lead into the contact point that the attempts dissolved into tumbling shapes and torn cloth. At some point, Collins and a squad from 3rd Platoon counterattacked along the inside of the berm, using grenade and bayonet to clear out a handful of sappers who had managed to wedge themselves under the lowest strand. Their silhouettes flickered in Reese's peripheral vision, dark shapes rising and falling in the flare glare, too close to risk shooting near. He shifted his fire a few degrees out, trusting them to handle the knife work while he kept the wider arc clean. The attack lasted maybe 30 minutes by the clock. For the men on the berm, it spanned an entire lifetime of fear and fury. Then, as suddenly as it had exploded, it thinned. Fire from the tree line slackened. No new figures moved in the kill zone. The last few shots from the enemy came in scattered pairs. Rearguards making sure they weren't being chased, or frightened men firing because their hands didn't know how to stop. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" came the call along the line, echoed by sergeants and lieutenants. "Check fires! Watch your sectors!" Reese's finger stayed curved around the trigger for a long second after the command, muscles reluctant to release. When he finally let go, the silence that followed rang louder than the gunfire had. His ears buzzed with a high, steady whine. He became abruptly aware of how hard he was breathing, each inhale hitching around the dull ache in his shoulder. "Reese, you still alive up there?" Morales shouted from the rear, voice raw. "Yeah," Reese managed. "It came out rough, but it came out." "Then stay put," Collins cut in. "No one leaves the pits until we're sure they're not setting a second wave. Medics are moving. We'll sweep at first light." The hours until dawn were a kind of limbo. Men reloaded magazines with shaking hands. Medics crawled from hole to hole, checking wounds under red lens flashlights. The artillery stayed loaded, tubes depressed just a little in case the jungle found its courage again. Rain pattered intermittently, turning blood-darkened clay into streaks and pools. From his forward bunker, Reese could see the dead only in fragments. An arm here, a leg there, the dark huddled mound of a sapper who had died almost touching the wire he'd set out to breach. The adrenaline that had carried him through the fight ebbed, leaving a hollow, jittery tiredness in its wake. His shoulder hurt in a real way now. Not the distant, numb awareness he'd felt earlier. His hands were cramped from holding the gun. When he reached for his canteen, his fingers trembled so badly he had to steady it against the sandbag. Only when the eastern sky finally began to grey did Collins authorize a sweep. Cautious groups moved out, boots picking their way through the brittle tangles of concertina and the uneven ground. The full picture of what the night had done emerged slowly. They found bodies in layers, some shredded by beehive, others cut down by Reese's fire, others still lying where they had tried to drag wounded comrades back and been caught mid-haul. The sappers carried lengths of bamboo ladder, coils of wire, explosive satchel charges. One had a folded, grease-stained sketch of Nolan's perimeter in his pocket, annotated in neat handwriting. On the hand-drawn map, the forward bunker Reese now occupied was marked as abandoned. Counting the dead was a grisly, imprecise job. The official after-action report would settle on over 24 enemy KIA in the northern and northwestern sectors, additional probable killed dragged from field. The men who had to step around the bodies would remember more. On the American side, Nolan had been mauled but not broken. One gun pit had taken a direct RPG and lost 2 men. Several others were wounded by fragments and small arms. A mortar crewman had a hole through his calf, where a bullet had found the one unarmored patch of leg between boot and flak. Morales sported a bruise the size of a dinner plate from a chunk of sandbag that had hit his chest like a fist. Doc's hands were slick with dried blood from hours of work. When Reese finally climbed down from the forward bunker, his legs nearly gave out. Mud sucked at his boots. The M60 felt heavier than it ever had, as if all the rounds it had fired now weighed it down. He slung it anyway, unwilling to let anyone else carry it. At the lip of the trench, Collins met him with a look that tried very hard not to be outright astonishment. The lieutenant's own uniform was torn and smeared. His helmet sat cocked at an angle, strap hanging loose. "Jesus, Reese," he said quietly, "you made every VC within 50 meters rethink their life choices." Reese managed a tired half-smile. "They were going to make me rethink mine if I stayed put, sir." "You realize what that looked like from back here?" Collins asked. "You hopping the berm with that pig while everything was blowing up? Half the platoon thinks you've lost your damn mind." "Maybe," Reese said. He glanced back at the bunker, at the churned ground in front of it. "But it worked." Ooh. The paperwork that followed would translate that worked into citation language, with complete disregard for his own safety, personally manned an exposed forward position, delivered devastatingly accurate fire, disrupted enemy sappers, and prevented a breach of the perimeter. Later, in rear areas far from Nolan's red clay, men in pressed uniforms would sign their names at the bottom of those words and send them back up the chain. Reese didn't see any of that morning. He saw only men with litters, a chaplain murmuring over a poncho-covered form near the 105 pit, and a dog handler gently stroking his animal's ears while the dog shivered, still smelling the blood and cordite in the air. In the weeks that followed, Word about the crazy M60 gunner at Nolan drifted along the grapevine that connected infantry companies and firebases. Details shifted in the retelling. Some said he'd run 50 meters through open ground under RPG fire. Others insisted the enemy had overrun the wire and he'd single-handedly thrown them back with grenades when the gun jammed. In some versions, there were hundreds of attackers. In others, he'd been the only man standing while everyone else cowered. Reese himself corrected the extremes when he could, mostly because they made him uncomfortable. Yes, he'd run to the forward bunker. Yes, the enemy had been close. Yes, the M60 had done terrible work. But he'd also had Morales feeding him ammo, riflemen on his flanks, artillery behind him, and men like Collins making hard decisions under pressure. On the other side of the wire, in tree lines and bunkers further west, survivors of the VC company told their own version. They spoke of an American machine gun that had suddenly appeared far forward, spitting fire from a place their map insisted was empty. They cursed the beehive rounds that had shredded their sappers, even as those men tried to earn their unit glory. Some insisted the gun never stopped firing, others swore they'd hit the bunker again and again, only to have the gun rise from the dust, like something that refused to die. They did not know the gunner's name, they didn't need to. For them, the night at Nolan became a cautionary story about underestimating the base soldiers and about how a single man in the wrong place, with the right weapon and just enough stubbornness, could ruin a carefully rehearsed attack. Years later, long after War Zone C had turned back into fields and scrub, and the red clay of Tay Ninh had baked under quiet suns, Daniel Reese would find himself trying to explain that night to people who had never worn a flak jacket or tasted red dust in their teeth. He'd talk about the heat, the smell, the way flares made everything look like bad black and white film. If they pushed, he'd admit he'd been scared in a way that never fully left his bones. He might even mention that, for a few long minutes on a dark berm in 1969, running toward the wire with a machine gun had felt like the only rational thing left to do in a world gone insane.